They thought they had seen every horror slavery could produce. But in the backwoods of Alabama, deep inside the cramped dirt-floored slave cabins that lined a sprawling plantation, something began happening that no one, not even the most hardened overseers, could explain. For months, white infants kept appearing in the cabins of enslaved black women. Infants with pale skin, light hair, and unmistakable features that made it clear these were not the children of the enslaved men. Whispers spread through the quarters. Overseers grew suspicious. Plantation owners became frantic. How were these babies ending up here? Who was responsible? And why did it keep happening despite punishments, interrogations, and desperate attempts to hide the truth? But when the real answer finally began to surface, it exposed a secret so disturbing, so deeply rooted in the brutal machinery of slavery, that even the men who profited from the system recoiled. Because behind those mysterious white infants was a pattern of abuse, exploitation, and forbidden relationships that the South never wanted recorded. A truth that reveals one of the darkest, most uncomfortable realities of American slavery. This is the story Alabama tried to bury, one that forces us to confront what really happened behind closed doors on the plantations, and why those white babies kept appearing where they were never supposed to be. The first signs were small, almost easy to dismiss, the kind of detail that could slip through the cracks of a plantation routine built on exhaustion, monotony, and fear. In the early hours before sunrise, when the air hung heavy with Alabama humidity and the enslaved workers stirred quietly to prepare for another day in the fields, a midwife whispered to another woman that something was wrong. In one of the tiny cabins, no larger than a shed, an infant had been found wrapped in scraps of cloth. That alone wasn't unusual. Babies were born often on plantations. What jolted everyone awake was the child's appearance. The infant's skin was pale, not the soft brown or deep mahogany so familiar in the quarters, but startlingly white. His hair was a thin, light fuzz, and his eyes, though not yet fully developed, carried a color no one could ignore. At first those who saw him exchanged uneasy glances, each woman silently asking the same question but none daring to speak it aloud. Word traveled swiftly, spreading from cabin to cabin, but always in whispers, careful, measured, fearful. The plantation's rules were absolute, and news of any unusual birth could trigger attention from the overseer, attention that seldom meant anything good. The owner, when informed, reacted with a mixture of irritation and calculated restraint. White men fathering children with enslaved women was not new in the South, but it was something plantation owners preferred to ignore, deny, or hide. A single white infant could be dismissed as an unfortunate, shameful incident, a lapse in morality blamed on a reckless overseer or an impulsive poor white farmer passing through. But the owner sensed something different in the nervous way the women spoke, the way the midwife hesitated before recounting the discovery, the way several enslaved men kept their eyes fixed to the floor as if bracing for accusations. Still, he told himself it was an isolated incident, a scandal to quietly smother, nothing more. Weeks passed. The rhythms of forced labor continued. Cotton was picked, bales were weighed, punishments were delivered with predictable cruelty. Life in the quarters, harsh and unforgiving, settled back into its familiar misery. And then it happened again. Another infant, another cabin, another white baby. This time, the reaction was different. Shock turned into dread. Overseers marched through the quarters, questioning the women, demanding names, explanations, confessions. But the enslaved women had nothing to give them. They had been silenced long before, conditioned to hide their pain, to bury their experiences, to shield themselves as best they could from consequences they had never deserved. The second infant's discovery spread faster than the first, crossing boundaries between enslaved families, reaching even the men who had been sold off from other plantations and were hardened to cruelty. They sensed something unraveling, something too dangerous to speak openly of, yet too alarming to ignore. When the third infant appeared, the atmosphere shifted from tension to panic. 3 white babies in 3 months. This could not be coincidence, nor could it be dismissed as the misbehavior of a single man. Plantation owners were not naive. They understood the violence woven into the system they maintained. But what they could not tolerate was anything that hinted at disorder or an erosion of control. The sight of a white baby in the slave quarters was not a moral problem, it was a political one, a threat to hierarchy, proof that white authority was not as absolute as it pretended to be. So the owner called a meeting. Overseers, patrollers, and trusted white men gathered inside the large house, voices rising behind closed doors as they debated who was responsible. Some blamed drunken field hands from neighboring farms, others pointed fingers at traveling peddlers, at unknown trespassers, at anyone whose guilt would keep suspicion away from the plantation's leadership. But even as they argued, each man knew the truth was far more likely, far closer to home. Meanwhile, in the quarters, the women lived in mounting fear. They were forced to continue their back-breaking labor, while knowing any of them could be dragged in for questioning at any moment. Some cried quietly when alone, others became guarded, refusing even to speak to close friends. A few began sleeping in groups, huddled in corners of their cabins, terrified of footsteps in the night. Mothers clutched their children more tightly. Men paced outside their cabins after dark, powerless to protect their families from threats they couldn't identify or fight. The midsummer heat intensified the suffocating dread, making every breath feel heavier. The fourth infant's arrival shattered whatever illusions remained. By then even the enslaved children sensed something was terribly wrong, watching the adults move with tense, haunted expression. The women who assisted in the births grew weary and fearful, knowing each white infant drew harsher scrutiny and deadlier suspicion. And it wasn't only the overseers who became desperate. The plantation owner's wife, humiliated and furious, began confronting the enslaved women directly, demanding to know which of them had been encouraging the attention of white men. Her rage, only partially restrained, was dangerous. She could order punishments of her own, and several women were beaten severely despite having no knowledge of what had been happening. The injustice was overwhelming, but the women bore it in silence, knowing resistance could cost their lives. By the time the fifth baby was found, the story could no longer be hidden. Even within the boundaries of the plantation, neighbors whispered, other owners made inquiries, patrollers intensified their nightly round. The plantation's reputation was at stake, and in a society where reputation held the weight of law, an internal scandal involving white infants in slave cabins threatened to unravel everything the owner believed he controlled. The presence of each new baby marked a failure not only of morality, but of order, discipline, and the plantation's carefully cultivated image of dominance. Inside the slave cabins, however, a different understanding was forming. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. One woman confided quietly to another that she had heard footsteps outside her door at night. Another admitted she had awakened once to see the shadow of a man retreating into the darkness. Slowly, a picture began to take shape, fragmented, terrifying, unmistakable. The women suspected the truth, long before anyone dared whisper it aloud. What they feared most was not just the existence of the babies themselves, but the realization that someone, or perhaps several men, had been moving through the cabins regularly, intentionally, without restraint or consequence. As the months stretched on, tension reached a breaking point. The appearance of white babies was no longer an anomaly, but a sign of something far more sinister working in the shadows of the plantation. A secret that the enslaved women had been forced to endure and the white men had attempted to bury, now surfacing in the most undeniable, fragile form possible. Newborn lives that carried the evidence on their skin. The second appearance of a white infant inside the slave quarters shattered whatever fragile sense of normalcy the plantation clung to. At first, some tried to brush off the initial case as a shameful but isolated lapse, the kind of buried scandal that plantations quietly managed and pretended never happened. But when another pale-skinned baby emerged only weeks later, wrapped in the same kind of makeshift cloth, discovered in the same suffocatingly small cabin where enslaved families slept shoulder to shoulder, the illusion of order began to crack. Plantation owners relied on predictability, predictable labor, predictable obedience, predictable suffering. Anything that disrupted that rhythm felt like a threat, and the second white child did exactly that. It forced everyone, from the owner down to the smallest enslaved child, to confront the possibility that something far more calculated and frightening was unfolding behind closed doors. The overseers reacted first. Word reached them before the dawn bell rang, carried by a trembling midwife whose voice faltered each time she described what she had seen. A white infant, unmistakable in appearance, born to an enslaved woman who insisted she had no idea how this child had come to be. The overseers exchanged sharp looks, men accustomed to handling disruptions with brute force, but not accustomed to mysteries that exposed the plantation's vulnerability. They understood immediately that the owner would want answers, and answers quickly, regardless of whose back those answers had to be beaten from. So they marched into the quarters, their boots heavy on the dirt floor, their tempers sharpened by fear disguised as authority. The enslaved women, already exhausted from labor and barely recovered from their last punishments, felt dread settle in their stomachs, as questions slammed into them one after another. Who had been sneaking around the cabins at night? Who had seen anything unusual? Who was protecting the guilty? Their voices trembled as they answered that they knew nothing. Their eyes stayed downcast, their bodies stiff, their minds replaying memories they wished they could erase. Many had heard whispered footsteps before. Some had woken up in the dark with a sense of being watched. Others had stories they would never speak, experiences that left them hollow, bruised and silently terrified. But fear of retribution, fear for themselves, fear for their children forced them to swallow their truths, and respond only with trembling denial. The owner, when informed of the second infant, grew pale with anger, rather than guilt. In his perspective, the issue was not the moral atrocity unfolding under his own roof, but the looming question of control. A single white baby, he could smother as a rumor. A second forced him into a corner. Neighbors might hear, other plantation owners might whisper. His reputation, carefully curated through years of brutality masquerading as discipline, could be at risk. And so he ordered an immediate investigation, not to uncover the true source of the problem, but to identify a scapegoat quickly enough to calm his spiraling fear. He blamed passing strangers, accused enslaved men of plotting, suggested that the women were welcoming secret admirers from outside. Anything at all, except admitting the far more likely truth, that the perpetrators walked freely on his land wearing the same skin he did. As panic spread among the plantation's white leadership, the enslaved community felt a different kind of fear clutch at them. They had no power, no voice, no protection, and now they were being accused of participating in something they had no agency over. Women found themselves pulled aside, interrogated for hours, threatened with separation from their children if they did not confess. The owner's wife, humiliated by the implication that her own household harbored such scandals, turned her fury on the enslaved women with a bitterness that bordered on cruelty. She called them temptresses, blamed them for distracting men, hurled insults that cut deeply into hearts already wounded beyond measure. She refused to entertain the possibility that the men might be at fault, that they might be exploiting the very women she was condemning. The tension became suffocating. Overseers doubled their patrols, stomping through the quarters at night, with lanterns that cast harsh yellow light through the cracks of the cabins. Their shadows crawled over sleeping families like dark reminders of the danger lurking outside their wooden wall. Enslaved parents held their children tighter, whispering prayers into their hair, hoping the next sunrise would not bring punishment or separation. Every sound in the night, each snapping twig, each distant hoofbeat, each whisper of wind through the trees, felt charged with fear. Yet the more the white men searched for answers, the more their panic grew. Punishments yielded no confessions, threats yielded no clarity. Their anger simmered into desperation, and desperation was a dangerous fuel. The owner convened a private meeting with his most trusted white staff. Behind closed doors they debated every possibility that would keep blame from settling on the plantation's leadership. They built stories, crafted lies, rehearsed explanations they could offer to others if pressed. But deep down, several of them knew the truth. They knew because they themselves had participated in, or witnessed the late-night movements, the quiet doors opening, the whispered exchanges, the abuses the enslaved women were too terrified to speak of. The enslaved men felt an agony of their own. Many had long suspected, long feared, long known that white men were forcing themselves on the women at night. They had heard muffled cries through thin cabin walls. They had seen bruises that explanations couldn't justify. They had heard footsteps that didn't belong to them. But confronting a white man meant death, and even attempting to intervene meant the same. So they lived with an unbearable mixture of rage and helplessness, trapped in a system designed to strip them of the ability to protect their own families. As the weeks passed, the pressure became relentless. The second white baby had transformed the plantation into a battlefield of suspicion, tension, and rising fury. The enslaved women began avoiding even looking at one another, afraid that a shared glance might be misinterpreted as a conspiracy. The men walked with their shoulders tense, their eyes constantly scanning for danger. Even the children sensed the shift, their play subdued, their laughter replaced by silence. Everyone was waiting, bracing, fearing what the third discovery might bring, because they all knew that if two white infants had appeared, a third was not just possible but inevitable. And when it did, the fragile mask of control the owner desperately clung to would shatter in a way no one could predict. The arrival of the second white infant didn't just raise suspicion. It set off a chain reaction of paranoia and desperation, pushing both the enslaved and the white plantation leadership into a state of heightened fear, each side reacting for different reasons, but both knowing that something sinister was moving in the shadows, something that would not remain hidden for long. Whispers had always been part of life in the slave quarters, soft threads of communication woven between exhaustion and fear. But after the second white infant appeared, those whispers took on a different weight, heavier, sharper, filled with questions no one dared ask out loud. The enslaved women moved through their days with tense shoulders and downcast eyes, doing their chores with practiced precision, while their minds churned with dread. In a world where silence had always been survival, speculation became both a danger and a necessity. Something was happening in the shadows of the plantation, something that left evidence in the form of pale-skinned infants cradled in cabins where they did not belong. The enslaved people had long been forced to know things they could never speak of,
But now those unspoken horrors were materializing in ways nobody could deny. At night, when the fields fell quiet and only the insects kept their rhythm, the whispers grew bold. Women huddled together in small groups, sharing stories of unexplained footsteps outside their doors, of doorknobs turning softly in the darkness, of shadows lingering near windows when no one was supposed to be awake. Some admitted they had been approached by white men in the past, overseers, patrollers, the master's sons, even visiting traders, men who treated them like property in ways that extended far beyond labor. Others had scars they never explained, memories that clawed at them when they tried to sleep. The older women recognized the pattern immediately, because they had lived it themselves when they were young. They had seen friends give birth to children whose existence was denied and whose skin told the truth. But what troubled them now was the frequency, the unnatural repetition. One child could be dismissed as a tragedy, two could be explained away as coincidence. But if the rumors were correct, more had come before, or were soon to come again. The enslaved men felt a different kind of pain, one that gnawed at their insides and left them seething in quiet agony. Many of them were fathers, husbands, brothers, partners in the only ways they were permitted to be. They had built fragile families under conditions where those families could be torn apart at any moment, and now they were forced to confront a horror they were powerless to stop. They could not protect the women they loved. They could not confront the white men responsible. Even raising their voice risked brutal punishment or sale. So the men listened to the whispers with clenched fists, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. They noticed new bruises on women they cared about. They noticed the late-night sobbing that drifted through the walls. They noticed the way certain women avoided particular overseers. They noticed everything, and noticing was its own kind of torment. Whispers among the enslaved children added another layer. Children were always the invisible observers of plantation life, witnessing things adults wished they never had to see. They overheard conversations they didn't fully understand, but they repeated pieces of them in innocent voice. They told stories of men walking between cabins after dark, of doors that weren't fully shut, of mothers crying quietly while rocking newborns that did not resemble anyone in their family. The adults tried to hush them, afraid their words might reach the wrong ears, but children had a way of speaking truths without understanding their danger. From their murmurs emerged a chilling image of a plantation where boundaries were shattered night after night, where the darkness hid crimes the daylight could no longer ignore. Among the women, fear mixed with suspicion, not suspicion of one another, but suspicion of who among the white men was taking advantage of the power they wielded. Some believed it was the overseers, notorious for abusing their position whenever they pleased. Others whispered that the master's eldest son, recently returned and known for his arrogance, had been seen lingering near the quarters after sundown. A few spoke of the patrollers who rode the property at night, men who felt emboldened by authority and armed with the knowledge that any accusation against them would be dismissed. And there were darker rumors still, rumors that the master himself, slipping away from the big house during his drinking nights, might be the most dangerous presence of all. But these suspicions had to remain contained. To speak them aloud was to invite death. As the whispers drifted through the cabins, they created a portrait of abuse that no one could piece together fully but everyone could feel in their bones. Women began warning each other not to sleep alone. They moved pallets closer together. They checked their doors twice before lying down. They taught their daughters to sleep with their backs against the wall. One woman began pretending to pray deep into the night, hoping the sound would ward off any unwanted intruder. Another sprinkled ashes near her door so she could see footprints in the morning. Most knew these were small defenses, nearly useless, but they did what they could with the fragments of control they possessed. The overseers noticed the silence in the quarters, the way conversation halted when they approached. Their suspicion intensified. They saw the looks the enslaved women exchanged. They sensed the hidden stories in the air, and they grew harsher, convinced that secrecy meant rebellion. They had no idea the truth was far more personal, far more intimate, far more rooted in the very men who claimed to maintain order on the plantation. The enslaved community wasn't planning revolt. They were trying to survive an invisible enemy hiding in plain sight. At the same time, the owners' attempts to blame outsiders only fueled more whispers. The enslaved knew better. Outsiders had no reason to move silently between their cabins at night, no reason to target specific women, no ability to navigate the plantation's layout with such familiarity. Only men who lived there, worked there, ruled there could move so boldly without fear of being caught. The women shared details with one another quietly, details they couldn't afford to speak openly but couldn't ignore either. One remembered smelling the master's cologne on her bedding. Another recognized the heavy gait of the younger overseer. Another recalled the creak of a floorboard that only someone from the big house would know. These whispered theories were not guesses. They were survival instincts sharpened over years of living under terror. The women were mapping patterns the way enslaved people had always done, silently, cautiously, with eyes always searching for meaning in things others never even noticed. They didn't have the power to stop what was happening, but they had the power to understand it, to brace for it, to try to protect one another in the smallest ways possible. As the pattern of white babies continued to emerge, the whispers grew less like rumors and more like warning. The enslaved people could feel something gathering, something pushing toward a breaking point. The truth was forming slowly, painfully in the quiet conversations exchanged under moonlight and behind closed cabin doors. Everyone sensed that whatever force was driving these births was not accidental, not isolated, not benign. It was deliberate, shadowed and hungry for secrecy. Yet secrecy could not survive.
The truth began to reveal itself not through confessions or investigations but through patterns the enslaved women recognized long before the white men in charge ever admitted something was wrong. Each new white infant that appeared in the slave cabins was another piece of a puzzle no one wanted to assemble. The women who lived through the nights, who bore the bruises and carried the weight of memories they could never speak aloud, slowly started to understand a chilling reality. The births were not accidental, not random, not the result of a single man's violence. They were the product of something far more widespread, something spreading like a sickness through the plantation. White men, multiple white men, were forcing themselves on enslaved women in a way that was coordinated not by words but by silence, an unspoken understanding among those who believed the bodies of enslaved women were theirs to claim. The violence was not always loud. Oftentimes it was the quiet that defined it. Footsteps in the dirt, long after the cabins had gone still, the faint creak of a door opening when the wind was too calm to blame, a lantern's glow appearing briefly near the quarters extinguished the moment a woman stirred. Some women awoke with the weight of a body already upon them, pressed into the darkness so hard they could barely breathe. Others were dragged outside into the humid night, far enough from the cabins that their muffled cries would be swallowed by the tall grass and the chirping insect. For some, the abuse came from men they recognized by voice, scent, or the way their hands gripped their arms. For others, the shadows hid the identity of the intruder, leaving them with only terror and questions that had no safe answer. What made it unbearable wasn't just the violence itself but the knowledge that it was happening repeatedly, systematically, and with a level of coordination that suggested more than individual wrongdoing. Women who had never spoken to one another about their assaults began noticing similarities: visits on the same nights, marks in the same places, threats whispered in the same tone. They knew better than to ask which white man it had been, because knowing wouldn't change the danger and speaking it aloud could bring deadly consequences. Instead, they exchanged silent glances in daylight, glances that carried entire stories in a single look. They recognized the haunted expressions in one another's eyes, the tremors in their hands as they washed clothes by the river, the way some women flinched at the mere sight of a white man passing by. The enslaved men saw signs too. They noticed women waking up with shaking limbs, withdrawing into themselves, refusing to speak even to those closest to them. They noticed men from the big house lingering near the quarters more often than usual, pretending to be inspecting the property while their eyes followed young women carrying water or tending to children. And the men noticed the white infants, undeniable living proof of crimes committed in the dark, but they could do nothing. They were trapped in a system engineered to destroy their ability to protect their family. One wrong move, one act of intervention, one attempt to defend the women they loved, and the punishment would be swift and deadly. Their rage had nowhere to go except inward, festering behind clenched jaws and silent tears shed in the privacy of the woods when no one was watching. As more white men took advantage of the enslaved women, their confidence grew. They acted with impunity, emboldened by the knowledge that no one would hold them accountable. Overseers exchanged smirks as they passed one another during the day. Patrollers joked quietly among themselves at the edge of the fields, their comments sharp and vile, though never loud enough for the plantation owner to overhear. Even the owner's sons began acting strangely, disappearing from the big house at odd hours with excuses that grew thinner by the day. One of them had a habit of slipping out during thunderstorms, when the natural noise huse cover. Another preferred hot, moonless nights when the quarters were stifling and sleep came only in restless waves. What made the pattern clearer was how the violence spiked after the owner's private meetings with his staff. When pressure mounted from the unexplained infants, instead of restraining themselves, the white men seemed to retaliate against the enslaved women as though punishing them for revealing a truth they had never consented to carry. The nights grew more dangerous. The women learned to sleep lightly, waking at the sound of crunching gravel or the distant bark of a dog. Some tried staying awake all night, But exhaustion eventually overcame even their strongest attempts to remain vigilant. The darkness always returned, and with it came the footsteps of men who believed themselves invisible. The assaults were not random moments of opportunity. They followed a grim order. Certain cabins were targeted repeatedly. Younger women were often chosen first, especially those without husbands or male relatives nearby. Women who worked in the big house were sometimes assaulted on their way back to the quarters after dusk. Others were taken in storage sheds, barns, or among the trees near the field. The men responsible treated the women like livestock, their visits timed with the same predictability as overseers checking the cotton weight at day's end. And whenever a woman became pregnant, she was forced to continue working long past the point of exhaustion, her body laboring under the weight of a child created through violence. What made it all the more horrifying was the complete silence imposed upon the victim. They were forced into obedience through a cycle of threats, punishments, and emotional torment. Men warned them that speaking out would result in their children being sold away. They promised to whip their husbands or fathers if they resist. Some men used the threat of the auction block as leverage, dangling the possibility of family separation like a blade over their heads. The women were trapped in a hell where suffering was punished, silence was demanded, and even their bodies were not their own. The white men who committed these assaults knew they were protected by the structure of slavery itself. The law did not recognize rape of an enslaved woman as a crime. Society viewed the children born of these assaults as economic assets rather than human lives. The plantation owner understood that each mixed-race child reflected a failure of discipline under his watch, but he chose to blame the women rather than acknowledge the men's crimes, and in doing so he created an environment where the abuses multiplied. As months passed, the enslaved community reached an unspoken understanding. The violence was no longer the work of a single predator, but a group of men using the system to satisfy their desires without consequence. The white infants that appeared were not isolated miracles or mysteries. They were evidence of a pattern, a ring of exploitation allowed to flourish in the shadows of the plantation, protected by silence powers, and the twisted logic of slavery that denied enslaved people even the right to their own bodies. The truth about what was happening on the plantation grew darker with every passing month, and by the time several white infants had appeared in the slave quarter, a terrible pattern began to take shape, one that revealed a hidden network of nighttime visits, orchestrated not by a single man, but by a circle of white men who believed themselves untouchable. Overseers, patrollers, hired hands, and even the plantation owner's own son moved through the darkness with a sense of entitlement so deeply rooted that they barely bothered to hide it. What emerged was an unspoken system, a quiet but coordinated routine of exploitation that the enslaved women were forced to endure in suffocating silence. It began with small movements, an overseer lingering near the fields after dusk, pretending to check tools or livestock, a patroller riding slowly past the quarters long after the nightly curfew, dismounting his horse under the guise of investigation, the owner's son slipping out the back door of the big house while the rest of the family slept, his footsteps soft on the packed dirt path that led toward the cabins. Each man moved with purpose, navigating the plantation grounds with familiarity and confidence. They knew which cabins held younger women, which ones had husbands who slept lightly, which ones had loose door hinges or broken shutters. They knew the blind spots of the patrollers' routines, because the patrollers themselves were often part of the routine. For the enslaved women, nightfall became a time of dread. They learned to distinguish the different footsteps in the dark, the heavy and patient stride of an overseer, the cautious, measured steps of the owner's eldest, the crunch of gravel signaling the approach of patrollers who laughed quietly among themselves before slipping into a cabin like thieves with no fear of being caught. The women tried anything they could to protect themselves, but the men who targeted them operated with the advantage of status, power, and weapons. They could enter any cabin they wanted, they could choose any woman they pleased, and no one could challenge. The coordination was never discussed openly, yet it existed in the way the men acted, in the timing of their visits, in the way one man's departure often signaled another's arrival. Sometimes two men crossed paths near the slave quarters, exchanging a smirk or a nod before moving on to their respective target. Other nights, one man would approach a cabin only to retreat after noticing another's boot prints in the dirt outside the door, choosing instead to prey on a different woman. There was no written agreement, no verbal plan. Their network operated through understanding alone, through the shared belief that enslaved women were property to be used and violated without consequence. The owner's son played a significant role in this silent machinery. Young, arrogant, and raised in an environment that taught him he could do no wrong, he treated the quarters as his personal domain. When he wanted to assert his power or escape the scrutiny of his mother, he descended into the slave cabins with an unsettling calmness. He preferred nights when the sky was moonless, when the shadows were so thick the women couldn't see his face until he was already inside. Some whispered that he kept track of which women were most vulnerable,
targeting those who had recently lost family members or had been punished, knowing their spirits were too broken to resist. The women learned to avoid his eyes during the day, because any expression he interpreted as invitation, even something as simple as meeting his gaze, could result in a nighttime visit. The overseers were worse in some way. Hardened by years of violence and alcohol, they felt no need to hide their intentions. They walked with a swagger, their lanterns swinging at their sides as they marched into the quarters night after night. Sometimes they visited the same woman repeatedly, leaving her bruised, exhausted, and terrified to sleep. Other times they cycled through different cabins as though working down an invisible lift. They joked about these visits among themselves, smirking during work hours as they spoke to the women they had victimized earlier that same morning. They wielded the whip by day, and used the threat of it by night. Patrollers added to the terror. These men tasked with policing enslaved people used their authority as an excuse to wander the plantation freely at any hour. They often rode in groups of 2 or 3, scanning the cabins for any sign of trouble, which could mean anything from suspected rebellion to nothing at all. Their presence provided cover for their true intentions. Under the guise of ensuring order, they crept into cabins, pinned women down, and threatened to accuse them of breaking curfew if they cried out. Their uniforms gave them the illusion of legitimacy, and their actions were rarely questioned. This network became so entrenched that the enslaved women began keeping track of the men's patterns, sharing warnings in hushed tones whenever possible. If one woman noticed the overseer heading toward the quarters earlier than usual, she hurried to whisper warnings to those whose cabins he favored. If the owner's son had been drinking heavily, the women braced themselves, knowing he was more likely to roam the grounds in such a state. If the patrollers were on edge after rumors of escaped enslaved people circulated through the county, their visits grew more violent, more frequent, more erratic. The women formed their own quiet system of protection, though it was often ineffective against men determined. Some slept in groups, pressing mats together to create a barrier of bodies. Others tied strips of cloth around the door handles to make it harder to push open, though the men kicked the doors down easily when frustrated. A few tried sleeping in corners behind piles of firewood or tools, hoping the intruders would give up if they didn't immediately spot them in the dim lantern light. Some left their children awake to cry loudly if someone approached, hoping the noise might deter a man who didn't want attention drawn to his visit. But these small acts of defense usually failed, because the men were not deterred by crying children, locked doors, or the worst nights were when multiple white men moved across the plantation like predators hunting together, each entering different cabins within minutes of one another. The women could hear screams coming from nearby cabins but were powerless to intervene. Those who tried to fight back were beaten unconscious or dragged outside into the darkness, where the assault continued out of earshot. Those who cried too loudly risked their own children being harmed, and those who resisted in ways that left visible injuries were punished at dawn for defying. This hidden network operated for months, perhaps years, long before the white infants began appearing. Only when the children were born, small, pale, undeniable, did the consequences begin surfacing in ways impossible to hide. But even then the men responsible did not stop. If anything, the panic swirling through the plantation leadership made some men more reckless, more aggressive, more determined to assert control over the women whose bodies they believed they owned. The enslaved women carried this truth in silence, knowing that behind every white infant was not just a single crime, but a cycle of predatory visits protected by fear, power, and the cloak of darkness. The enslaved women on the plantation lived in a constant state of fear, a fear that stretched far beyond the brutal labor, the endless toil, and the cruelty that defined their existence. What weighed on them most heavily in those months was the knowledge that they were trapped in a world where their bodies were not their own, where any resistance could mean the destruction of everything they loved. The silence surrounding the appearance of the white infants was not born from confusion or mystery among the enslaved people. They understood exactly what was happening. The silence was enforced by the men who held absolute control over their lives, men who used threats, violence, and the unbearable power of separating families as weapons to ensure compliance. This silence was heavy, suffocating, and it lingered in every corner of the slave quarters like thick smoke, settling into every whispered conversation and every anxious glance exchanged between the women. The overseers began their nightly rounds with more aggression than ever, making sure the enslaved women knew that any mention of the truth, any hint of accusation, would be met with swift retaliation. They didn't need to shout. The crack of a whip delivered across a man's back for a minor offense was enough to communicate the consequences of stepping out of line. The overseers deliberately punished male slaves in front of the women to send a message. If the women talked, if they even let the truth slip in front of the wrong ears, their brothers, their husbands, their sons would be the ones to pay. It was a cruel tactic designed to break the women from every angle, turning their silence into an act of protection and survival. The women were forced to carry the weight of their own suffering to shield the men around them from further torment, and in that system their voices were all but stolen from them. Some nights the women would hear footsteps approaching the cabins long after the workday ended. They would hold their breath, praying quietly that the steps would pass them by, that the door would not creak open, that the eyes of one of the white men would not settle on them. But prayers rarely offered protection in a place where their humanity was denied. When the door did open, when the figure of a white man stepped inside, the women knew what was expected. They were not asked. They were not given a choice. They were treated as though their suffering was an inconvenience, something to be ignored in the shadows of lantern light. And when it was over, when the man left the cabin as though nothing had happened, the women were left to pick up the pieces of their dignity alone, with no outlet for their pain and no way to fight back. The threats were not always spoken direct. Many were implied through the structure of plantation life. Any woman who questioned an order found herself moved to a harsher field. Any woman who resisted too forcefully might see her child sold without warning, taken from her arms and placed on a wagon, heading to a plantation miles away. These punishments were strategic. They taught the enslaved women that even the smallest act of defiance held devastating consequences, and it reinforced the brutal truth that their oppressors could strip them of anything at any time. The women learned to endure silently, their pain becoming something they carried deep inside, shared only through small gestures of solidarity, an extra portion of food, a soft touch on the arm, a whispered prayer before dawn. The plantation owner's wife, though aware of more than she admitted publicly, played her own role in maintaining the silence. She believed the presence of white infants in the slave quarters reflected poorly on the household, not because it revealed the violence inflicted on the women, but because it exposed the indiscretions of the men. The wives of slaveholders were often caught in a twisted bind between acknowledging the exploitation happening under their own roofs, and protecting the reputation and stability of their marriage. She chose the latter. She would lecture the enslaved women about morality, about their so-called temptations, about keeping proper boundaries, all while ignoring the obvious power imbalance that rendered such lectures absurd. Her chastisements were another layer of manipulation, another reminder to the women that they would receive no sympathy, no justice, not even from the women of the household who might have been expected to understand the terror of unwanted advance. Instead, the enslaved women were treated as if they were the ones who needed correction, adding insult to injury and reinforcing the system that trapped them in silence. Within the slave community, attempts to comfort one another were made, but even those moments were tinged with fear. The women knew they could not openly discuss what was happening, not even among themselves, because overseers planted spies and informants in the quarters. A careless word could lead to retribution, and no one wanted to be the reason another woman or her family suffered. So the conversations took place indirectly, hidden within coded language and shared looks. They might talk about storms passing through the cabin at night, or shadows that won't leave us alone, metaphors carrying the weight of the truth without saying it out. The women became experts at communicating danger without speaking its name, at supporting one another in subtle ways that would not draw suspicion. Some women tried to protect themselves by slipping away into the fields after dark, hiding between rows of crops until the sun rose, but even that was risky. Being caught outside the cabin at night could result in brutal punishment for attempting to run off, even if the woman never left the plantation. Others tried to make themselves seem less desirable in the eyes of the white men by smearing ash on their faces, wearing oversized clothes, or intentionally appearing exhausted and sickly. These small acts of resistance, however desperate, were quiet attempts to reclaim even the smallest piece of autonomy over their own bodies. The men in the quarters felt the weight of the situation as well. They were unable to protect the women in their lives, unable to confront the white men without risking death, and they carried that helplessness like a wound. They were forced to watch the women they loved suffer, while pretending not to see, because acknowledging the truth out loud meant endangering everyone. Their silence too was an act of painful restraint, and it contributed to the atmosphere of tension that enveloped the quarter. The entire community lived in a relentless state of waiting for another baby to appear, waiting for another night visit, waiting for the next moment of violence they were powerless to stop. And so the women bore their burdens quietly, their trauma locked behind tight lips and lowered eyes, their emotions buried deep beneath the survival instincts that slavery demanded. The silence became a form of armor, a shield against the wrath of the men who held their lives in their hands, but also a suffocating reminder of their lack of freedom. They withdrew further into themselves as the months passed, stealing moments of rest where they could, whispering prayers that no one heard, holding on to fragments of hope.
The plantation's bookkeeping was supposed to be a tidy archive of property, births, deaths, and labor output, A system designed to reduce human lives to ink on paper. But in those months when the white infants began appearing in the slave cabins, the neatly kept records slowly started to reveal something the plantation owner never intended anyone to notice. It began subtly, with small inconsistencies, notations of births that didn't match the supposed paternity, ages that didn't make sense, infants marked as mulatto despite the absence of any recorded explanation. The ledger, meant to maintain order, instead became a silent witness to the truth the plantation leadership was desperate to conceal. And as the pages filled, the patterns grew harder to ignore, even for those who pretended not to see. The plantation owner kept the main ledger locked away in his study, but multiple smaller record books were handled by overseers, clerks, and even trusted house slaves who performed clerical tasks. It was in these overlapping documents that discrepancies began to stand out. Each baby listed under the name of an enslaved mother lacked a corresponding father, a detail the owner glossed over with vague marks or simple dashes. On other pages, the race of the newborn was lightly altered in the margins, as if the plantation clerk was instructed to rewrite history with his quill but could not erase the truth entirely. There were notes in different handwriting, some hurried, some heavily pressed into the paper, revealing the tension and confusion of those recording events they were not allowed to question. One of the enslaved men assigned to copying agricultural inventories began to notice the irregularities as he transcribed entries into fresh ledgers. He couldn't speak of it openly, but he saw how the columns shifted. A pattern of white-skinned infants born only to women known to have no relationships with men in the quarters. The sudden appearance of vague terms like father unknown, which had never been used before on the plantation. The nervous glances exchanged between overseers when they reviewed the weekly birth summaries. He saw everything, but like every enslaved person forced into close contact with the inner workings of the plantation, he understood the danger of acknowledging it. Still, the numbers etched themselves into his memory, forming a shape he could not unsee. The plantation owner's wife noticed something amiss as well, not because she cared for the enslaved people, but because she took pride in the household's organization and reputation. She would review the ledgers periodically, looking for errors she could attribute to incompetent staff. But the errors she found this time unsettled her more deeply. There were too many infants marked as light, too many unexplained births, too many notes temporarily scratched out and rewritten. Her discomfort, however, transformed not into sympathy but into a cold, defensive calculation. She realized these inconsistencies pointed to misconduct among the white men of the household, including perhaps her own husband or her teenage son. And so she did what she believed necessary to protect the family name. She began quietly tearing out pages, burning them in the kitchen hearth when no one was watching, and ordering the clerk to start certain records over from scratch. Yet even as some records were destroyed, others resurfaced from unexpected corners of the plantation. Overseers maintained their own logs tracking the productivity of laborers, the health of mothers, and the status of children. These logs, less guarded, painted the clearer picture. In one overseer's record, a series of notations revealed his growing discomfort. Child born with lighter complexion than expected. Infant hair fair. Owner raising questions. Mother denies relations with any man in quarter. His notes, though veiled in coded language, betrayed the fact that even those enforcing the system could not completely ignore what was happening. In another overseer's book, the handwriting grew more frantic over time, as if he struggled to keep his composure while documenting events that threatened the plantation's veneer of order. On nights when the enslaved midwives assisted with births, they too became record keepers in their own way. Though they were never allowed to write in the official ledgers, their memories held details far more accurate than the plantation's paper trail. They remembered every infant's face, every skin tone, every resemblance they wished they hadn't noticed. They knew which babies would be categorized as house servants due to their light skin, and which would be subjected to harsher field labor purely based on the whims of the owner. They kept a mental catalog of fathers who would never be acknowledged in ink, men whose power allowed them to hide in the shadows while the consequences of their actions lay in the arms of women who had no ability to refuse them. The midwives spoke softly to one another in secret about how the official records did not match reality, but even their whispers were careful and coded, because a misplaced word could bring danger. As more white infants appeared, the plantation leadership tried to tighten control over the documentation, hoping to rewrite the unfolding truth. A new policy was introduced: only one clerk, chosen for his loyalty and silence, would handle the primary ledger. But while they aimed to centralize information, the attempt only magnified the inconsistency. Birth dates were altered slightly, paternity lines intentionally left blank, and racial classifications adjusted downward from white to mulatto or quadroon to preserve social boundaries that were already crumbling in reality. It was a desperate effort to maintain the fiction that slavery operated on clean racial divisions, that white men did not routinely violate the enslaved women, and that the plantation was a place of stability rather than exploitation. But the more they tried to hide, the more obvious the truth became to anyone paying attention. Even visiting traders who reviewed the ledger when purchasing enslaved laborers raised questions. They would pause, tapping their fingers on lines that didn't add up, asking cautiously why so many light-skinned children appeared on a single plantation within such a short time. The plantation owner would offer clipped explanations, distant ancestry, unusual lighting during inspection, maternal claims of mixed heritage, anything to soothe suspicion. But the traders, experienced in the realities of the slave economy, understood what such patterns truly meant. They said nothing, because speaking openly could jeopardize business relationships, but they left the plantation with their own conclusions. As the months passed, the altered records became an impossible knot of contradiction. Some infants were recorded twice, once under different racial categories. Some births were left out entirely, only to reappear in peripheral documents. Some children were listed as having died early, a phrase often used to mask their relocation or the more the plantation leadership attempted to distort the truth, the more tangled the evidence became, leaving behind a paper trail that future generations would struggle to decipher, but that even in its confusion, pointed unmistakably to the exploitation happening behind closed doors. In the end, the ledgers became less a tool of control and more a haunting reflection of a truth that refused to stay buried. The ink, smeared and scratched out, held the shadows of secrets the plantation tried to erase, revealing that no matter how tightly they clenched their fists around the narrative, the truth was always there, slipping through the cracks, recorded in numbers and names, in forgotten margins, in the quiet details they never intended anyone to see. The rumors spread through neighboring plantations the way smoke drifts after a fire, slow at first, almost invisible, but eventually thick enough that no one could pretend not to see it. What began as quiet whispers among enslaved people who traveled between plantations for work, marriage or trade, soon reached the ears of local patrollers, traders and even small-town officials who prided themselves on knowing every scandal within several miles. In the rural South, information did not need newspapers to travel. It moved through markets, kitchens, cotton fields and church pews, carried in fragments of conversation that painted a far more honest picture of plantation life than the polished reputation slaveholders maintained. And once those fragments reached the outside world, the tension on the plantation tightened like a rope pulled from both ends, creating an atmosphere so charged that even the children felt it. At first, the neighboring plantation owners dismissed the rumor. They chalked them up to jealousy or mischief among enslaved people who, they assumed, misunderstood what they saw. But it soon became clear that the whispers were too persistent, too consistent, and too detailed to be baseless. Workers who moved between plantations spoke of infants with white skin being born in cabins where no white infant should ever exist. They spoke of overseers becoming more aggressive, of nighttime visits from white men that left the enslaved women withdrawn and shaken, of infants hidden for days before being brought into the open. These accounts, shared in low voices during water breaks or in the shadows of storage barns, spread faster than the plantation leadership expected. The enslaved people, despite isolation and brutality, maintained networks of communication so strong that information could travel farther and faster than any overseer might imagine. Local authorities picked up on the rumors. Sheriffs, patrol officers and court clerks did not care about the suffering of enslaved women, but they cared deeply about maintaining order and protecting white reputation. They knew that if enough suspicion built up around a specific plantation, it could spark unrest among enslaved communities, or worse, cast doubt on the moral character of the landowning families who controlled the region's economy. Officials visited casually at first, just to observe operations or inspect conditions, but their eyes lingered on the cabins longer than usual. They asked the overseers vague questions, pretending to be uninterested, but their ears strained to catch any hint of truth. They watched the enslaved women closely, noting the way some avoided eye contact, the way others held infants with skin far lighter than their own. The plantation owner felt the shift immediately. He sensed that the carefully built facade of his estate was beginning to crack. He noticed the way neighboring planters hesitated before shaking his hand, the way conversations cut off abruptly when he approached, the way a few men subtly steered their wives away from spending social afternoons with his family. Even in church, where Southern white society prided itself on unity and superiority, he could feel the weight of judgment pressing on him. He saw the looks, a mix of curiosity, suspicion and veiled disgust, from those who had heard the rumors but did not yet know the full truth. It angered him not because of guilt or remorse, but because his image, the most valuable possession a planter could have, was slipping out of his control. Inside the plantation, the tension became unbearable. The overseers, already on edge, interpreted the increasing scrutiny as a threat to their standing. They believed that if the plantation's reputation collapsed, they would be blamed for failing to keep order. This fear manifested as harsher discipline, stricter routines and more unpredictable punishments. They patrolled the cabins more frequently,
listening at doors and watching for any sign that the enslaved people were discussing the situation. Conversations in the quarters became shorter, more cautious, filled with coded words and nervous glances. The enslaved people knew that a single overheard sentence could lead to beatings or worse. And yet the pressure of silence grew heavier as the outside world began asking questions. As authorities in nearby towns grew more curious, they started quietly gathering information from traders and peddlers who passed through the plantation. These traders had no loyalty to anyone but their profit, and many of them had seen or heard enough to paint a partial picture. They mentioned in careful tones that the number of light-skinned infants seemed unusually high for a single plantation. They noted that the overseers appeared unusually nervous. Some said they had seen the owner's teenage son lingering around the slave cabins at night, though they phrased such observations in ways that would not implicate them in gossip if confronted. Still, these hints were enough to feed the growing unease. The owner, realizing he could no longer rely on silence alone, attempted to manipulate the situation. He hosted dinners, invited neighboring planters for hunting trips, and made a show of being calm and in control. But even in these social gatherings the tension remained. Men spoke to him politely while privately exchanging doubts. Some wondered whether the rumors reflected deeper instability on the plantation, instability that could spill over onto their own lands if left unchecked. Others, who had their own dark secrets to hide, worried the attention on this plantation could encourage scrutiny across the region. The enslaved community, meanwhile, felt the storm gathering even before the owner recognized its full force. They sensed it, in the way the overseers whispered among themselves, in the extra patrols, in the sudden inspections of the cabins. They could feel change coming, and though they hoped it might bring justice, their experience told them that it was more likely to bring punishment. They understood that when white men were afraid, they became dangerous, and fear often transformed into violence. As the pressure increased, small acts of resistance and defiance among the enslaved people grew more frequent, driven partly by desperation and partly by the unbearable injustice surrounding the white infant. Some women refused to answer overseers' questions directly, offering vague replies that infuriated the men in charge. Some men attempted to shield the women by taking blame for minor offenses, hoping to divert attention away from others. Simply prayed harder, gathering at night in secret to ask for divine protection, for truth to rise, or for punishment to fall on the right shoulders instead of theirs. When the first district official arrived under the guise of a routine inspection, the owner pretended not to notice the way the enslaved people stood more rigidly, the way some women clutched their children tighter than usual. He guided the official through the fields, through the gin house, through the main yard, carefully avoiding the cabins as long as possible. But officials always knew where to look. They requested to see the records, to speak briefly with the overseers, to walk through the slave quarter. They claimed they were checking for sanitation or structural stability, but their eyes scanned the faces of the children, lingering on the ones whose features raised questions no one dared to ask aloud. It was at this point that the plantation's fragile balance began to crumble. The records were inconsistent, the children's appearances impossible to explain, the overseer's answers rehearsed in tense, and as the official left, he carried with him more than suspicion. He carried confirmation that something deeply wrong was happening here, something dangerous enough that even the tightly controlled slaveholding society of Alabama could no longer pretend it didn't exist. By the time the ninth infant appeared in the slave quarters, the atmosphere on the plantation had shifted from tense unease to a quiet, simmering panic. The enslaved women who bore the burden of these births moved through their days with a weight pressing on their chests that was nearly physical. They could no longer imagine that the appearances of the white infants were isolated incidents. Every glance from a white man, every creak in a cabin floor, every unexplained shadow reminded them that the cycle of exploitation was ongoing and relentless. Sleep had become a fragile commodity. Some women would lie awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the night, straining to discern footsteps from wind, lanterns from fireflies, whispers from the trees. Their bodies were exhausted, their minds stretched taut with vigilance, and yet the pattern showed no sign of slowing. The enslaved men, already powerless in countless ways, felt an unrelenting pressure. They were forced to confront the reality that those who could defend the women in their lives were themselves shackled by fear. Any attempt to intervene could result in immediate fatal retribution, not just for themselves but for their entire families. This knowledge created an invisible tension in the quarters, an ever-present sense that danger could erupt at any moment. Even the youngest boys, old enough to understand enough of the world to fear it, carried the anxiety of men who understood the consequences of defiance too early in life. They watched silently as their mothers and sisters carried children that were reminders of crimes they could not punish, and the burden of helplessness pressed down on every shoulder in the cabin. The plantation owner, already aware that the pattern could not be fully contained, began taking desperate measures. He demanded that the overseers increase nighttime patrols, questioning the smallest deviations in behavior among the enslaved people. He insisted that women be separated by household or field assignment in ways that made the spread of information more difficult, attempting to isolate individuals to prevent them from speaking with one another. He pressed the clerks to sanitize the ledgers further, leaving fewer traces of paternity and complexion discrepancies. But even these actions revealed a certain panic. The owner's careful demeanor cracked when questioned by neighbors. When brief encounters in the marketplace hinted that rumors were spreading, his frustration bled into cruelty, resulting in harsher punishments, more public displays of authority, and an atmosphere in the quarters that was as suffocating as the heat of the Alabama summer. The overseers, meanwhile, were both enforcers and participants. Many of them were implicated, either directly or indirectly, in the nighttime visits. They moved with a brazen confidence, yet each step was shadowed by the fear that the secret might no longer be entirely hidden. They began keeping their own internal notes, informal jottings on scraps of paper or hidden in ledgers of other labor, tracking women who might be suspicious or children who were different. The act of documentation became a survival strategy for them, a way to maintain some semblance of control over events spiraling beyond anyone's grasp. The overseers had learned early that the appearance of white infants was no mere coincidence, yet the plantation hierarchy discouraged them from acknowledging the truth in any official capacity. They were trapped in complicity, fearing both exposure and the consequences of withholding information. The enslaved women responded with careful covert strategies of resistance. Though these strategies were limited and fraught with danger, some tried to create barriers in the cabins, using furniture, firewood or woven mats to make it physically harder for men to enter. Others whispered warnings to one another using coded language or signs, developing a silent communication that even children could participate in without risking detection. Mothers held their infants close, teaching them from birth to recognize the dangers of the world around them. The women had learned to adapt, to anticipate patterns, and to protect each other as best they could. But these methods were mere shadows of safety in the face of relentless systematic abuse. Outside the quarters, the whispers of the wider community began to thicken into rumors that could no longer be ignored. Visiting traders, local officials and neighboring planters started to compare notes, talking quietly about the strange frequency of pale infants appearing on the plantation. They asked oblique questions, enough to unsettle the plantation owner without directly accusing him. These questions reached his ears, feeding his paranoia. He began calling meetings with overseers and trusted clerks, demanding explanations for every detail in the ledger, scrutinizing the appearance and health of every child, and asserting that the problem must be caused by outsiders or some inexplicable event, rather than the men in positions of power on his own land. Even as the outside attention increased, the enslaved people felt the full brunt of the resulting tension. They could see the changes in patrol routines, hear the way men's voices hardened, notice the sudden bursts of punishment for minor offense. Every movement was monitored more closely, every word chosen with care. Children learned to lie quietly in their beds if they heard footsteps approaching, to hide their questions, to mirror the fear of adults whose authority over their lives was absolute. Yet despite this environment of constant surveillance, small acts of defiance persisted. A mother might whisper protective prayers over her child, a sister might pass a warning in a glance, a young woman might resist the physical approach of a man long enough to escape. These acts, though small and often fleeting, maintained a fragile thread of agency in a world determined to strip them of every human right. The plantation's record-keeping, meant to obscure the pattern, became increasingly contradictory and confused. Entries in ledgers were altered, erased, rewritten or misclassified. Some infants were listed under different racial categories in separate documents, while others disappeared entirely from official records only to reappear in unofficial notes. Even clerks and overseers tasked with maintaining order found themselves overwhelmed by the inconsistencies, their efforts to hide the truth only emphasizing the impossibility of erasing the pattern. Each new infant was undeniable evidence of the crimes committed, a living record that no ink or paper manipulation could fully conceal. This ninth infant became more than a symbol, it was a catalyst for heightened scrutiny and fear. The plantation owner's anxiety reached its peak as he realized the story was no longer containable. Neighbors' curiosity, traders' quiet observations, and the subtle but persistent knowledge within the enslaved community meant that the secret, once thought safely buried in darkness, was starting to leak into the world. The men in power, both white and enslaved, found themselves operating under layers of fear, suspicion, and anticipation. They understood that the events unfolding could no longer be explained away as coincidence or accident, and yet the consequences of exposing the truth were catastrophic. The enslaved women, aware of the external scrutiny, became even more cautious, relying on instinct and silent coordination to protect themselves and their children. They had learned to anticipate the timing of nighttime visits, to hide signs of bruising, to shield infants from prying eyes, and to communicate warnings without speaking the truth aloud. Their survival depended on these skills, and yet with each passing month, the burden grew heavier. They carried the evidence of violation in their bodies, in their children and in their hearts, knowing that no amount of cleverness or caution could fully prevent the cycle from repeating itself. Even as outside attention increased, the power dynamics on the plantation ensured that the white men responsible faced little threat of punishment. The owner, obsessed with reputation and control, directed his frustration outward at the enslaved women and men rather than confronting the complicity of those in his household. Overseers continued to patrol, abuse and document in secrecy, confident that the system itself protected them from accountability. The enslaved people bore witness to every violation, every act of betrayal, and every effort to erase the truth, understanding that the pattern was entrenched, deliberate, and devastating.
By the time the 10th infant appeared in the slave quarters, the weight of reality had become almost unbearable, pressing down on every soul within the plantation's boundaries. The enslaved women, already stretched thin by relentless labor, constant fear and the lingering trauma of previous assaults, faced yet another layer of horror, another child whose very existence was a living proof of crimes they could not stop and could not speak of. The presence of the 10th infant crystallized the terrifying scale of what had been happening for months, perhaps years. It was no longer possible to dismiss the pattern as coincidence or misfortune. Each successive birth revealed a deliberate, systematic abuse that had penetrated every level of plantation life, from the corridors of the big house to the deepest corners of the slave cabins. The enslaved women moved through the days with an almost robotic determination, performing tasks in the fields, kitchens, and quarters while their minds were occupied by the unbearable knowledge of what the night would bring. They had learned to recognize the signs, footsteps in the dirt outside, the faint glow of lanterns approaching, the subtle changes in the tone of a man's voice during the day. Their bodies, scarred by previous encounters, reacted before their minds could process the danger. Every glance from a white man, every unexpected presence near the cabins, every small disturbance in the ordinary rhythm of life, triggered instinctive anxiety. Yet despite their exhaustion and terror, they developed remarkable ways to protect themselves in whatever small, fragile ways were possible. They learned to signal warnings through subtle gestures, to anticipate movements, and to use the darkness as a shield. But the arrival of the 10th infant reminded them that these precautions could never fully guarantee safety. The enslaved men experienced a parallel agony, one that was deeply intertwined with the helplessness of their situation. They were fathers, brothers, husbands, partners, and friends, who had no legal or social power to defend the women they loved. Their awareness of the ongoing abuses, combined with the repeated appearance of white infants, left them with an unbearable sense of impotence. They could intervene in only the smallest ways, offering comfort or advice, warning someone to be cautious, or attempting to shield a younger woman from a man's approach. Yet they knew that any overt action could lead to brutal retaliation, not just against themselves but against the women and children they were trying to protect. This constant tension, this persistent fear, created an invisible atmosphere of dread that permeated every cabin and field. The plantation owner's response was a mixture of panic and calculation. He understood that the presence of 10 white infants, 10 undeniable pieces of evidence, could no longer be contained within the quiet walls of the plantation. Neighbors were already whispering, traders had observed unusual patterns, and officials had begun to ask questions. He redoubled efforts to manipulate perception, instructing clerks and overseers to revise ledgers, falsify birth records, and erase evidence wherever possible. He met with his wife in hushed conversations, discussing strategies to maintain appearances, protect the family name, and shift blame elsewhere. Yet beneath his outward composure there was growing unease. The truth, though buried in papers and hidden in shadows, had a way of pressing forward, relentless and insistent. The overseers, emboldened by their own power yet nervous under increased scrutiny, escalated their enforced. Nighttime patrols became more frequent, more unpredictable, and more violent. They intensified surveillance of the enslaved quarters, scrutinizing movements and listening for any sign of communication. Any woman caught speaking too freely, any child asking too many questions, any man observing too closely risked immediate punishment. The overseer's authority, which had long been a tool of control, now became an extension of fear itself, ensuring that the enslaved people lived in an environment where survival required constant vigilance, where silence was a shield, and where even minor errors could result in severe consequences. The enslaved women developed new methods of resistance in response to the increasing danger. Some chose to hide in corners, behind stacks of firewood or beneath pallets, waiting for an intruder to pass before cautiously emerging. Others feigned sleep, holding their breath and stilling their bodies until the threat moved on. They shared knowledge discreetly, teaching younger women how to anticipate the movements of those who sought to harm them. Each act of precaution, each whispered warning, each small attempt to reclaim autonomy represented a profound struggle against the system designed to strip them of agency. Yet the 10th infant served as a stark reminder that even the most careful planning could not fully prevent victimization. The enslaved children, growing aware of the horrors surrounding them, absorbed fear like a sponge. They watched their mothers and aunts, witnessing the strategies developed to protect the family, learning which actions might trigger danger and which might allow survival. These lessons, though terrifying, became ingrained, shaping their understanding of the world long before they could fully articulate it. The infants themselves, including the 10th child, became symbols of the abuses that had been hidden in darkness, innocent lives entwined in a cycle of violence they could never comprehend, yet could never escape. Outside the plantation, the ripple effects of the unfolding crisis were becoming impossible to ignore. Traders, neighbors, and officials noticed the patterns, the unusual concentration of white infants appearing in a single location, and they began piecing together a narrative of systematic abuse. Even those who had no moral concern for the enslaved people recognized that the situation was unstable and potentially scandalous. This external awareness increased the pressure on the plantation leadership, resulting in harsher measures to maintain appearances, stricter control of the enslaved population, and a deepening of the atmosphere of fear and secrecy. The record-keeping on the plantation became increasingly complex and contradictory as the 10th infant arrived. Clerks struggled to maintain the facade of order, altering documents, erasing entries, and inserting false information. Yet the inconsistencies became more pronounced, impossible to reconcile without leaving traces of manipulation. The ledger, which had once symbolized the owner's control, now reflected the chaos and moral corruption of the plantation. Every page became a silent witness, a record of violence, coercion, and the exploitation of power. Even as attempts were made to conceal the truth, the weight of evidence continued to accumulate, tangible in the patterns of births, the altered racial classifications, and the repeated appearance of white infants in the quarter. The social dynamics of the enslaved community adjusted in response to the 10th infant. Women became increasingly cautious in their interactions, sharing knowledge and warnings through subtle signals rather than words. Men observed and protected as best they could, reinforcing the importance of vigilance while managing their own fear and frustration. Children internalized the lessons of danger and survival, becoming silent participants in a system of mutual protection. In every cabin, in every field, in every whispered conversation, the 10th infant was present, not merely as a child, but as a reminder of the brutality that permeated every aspect of their lives and the constant vigilance required to endure it. Even as the external world began to notice, the cycle of abuse continued unabated. The 10th infant represented not a conclusion but a milestone in an ongoing pattern of exploitation and suffering. The enslaved people, aware of the growing scrutiny, adapted their behaviors while holding on to the small, fragile threads of survival and agency they had cultivated over months. The men in power, the plantation owner, his family, the overseers, and the patrollers, continued to operate with impunity, yet each day brought them closer to exposure, closer to the point where the carefully constructed facade could no longer hide the scale of their crime. The 10th infant was a symbol, a living testimony to the horrors concealed within the plantation walls, and a reminder that no matter how meticulously secrets were kept, truth had a way of asserting itself in ways that could not be fully controlled. The full horror of what had been unfolding on the plantation could no longer be hidden behind ledger entries, whispers, or the oppressive silence of fear. The pattern of exploitation, now undeniable in the 10 infants who had appeared, revealed the brutal truth. The system of slavery did not just steal labor, it stole bodies, innocence, and the right to exist without terror. The enslaved women, forced to endure unimaginable violations, carried within them the evidence of a crime that went far beyond any single night or single. Each child born into this web of abuse was a living testament to the cruelty that the plantation hierarchy protected. Yet even in that darkness, the resilience of the enslaved community persisted. They survived through whispered warnings, subtle gestures of solidarity, and the fierce determination to shield one another in ways no law could recognize, creating a quiet resistance that could not be erased. For the white men who perpetuated this cycle, the 10th infant marked both the peak of audacity and the fragility of their impunity. The more the truth accumulated, the more impossible it became to hide. Despite ledger alterations, threats, or intimidation, rumors had spread beyond the plantation, whispers had reached neighboring communities, and the presence of undeniable proof,
Innocent children whose very existence contradicted the official story, loomed like a shadow over the men who thought themselves untouchable. The weight of exposure, the growing awareness that their crimes were visible even to those who had been silent for too long, introduced a tension that could not be ignored. Power, once absolute, showed its limits in the face of relentless truth. The enslaved children too became witnesses in a world that refused to acknowledge their suffering. They carried the memory of their mother's strength, the hidden acts of protection, and the quiet courage that had preserved them through months of terror. These children, born from acts of violence and survival, became living testimony to the resilience of humanity in the face of oppression. Every glance, every touch, every whispered instruction passed from mother to child reinforced the lessons of vigilance, resistance, and endurance. Though society sought to define them as property, the truth embedded in their very being defied the lies of the plantation, proving that human spirit could not be completely subjugated. In the end, the 10th infant symbolized both the depths of cruelty and the unbreakable resilience of those forced to endure it. The plantation, with its records, its overseers, and its authority, had tried to erase, manipulate, and suppress the reality of systematic abuse. Yet despite every effort to conceal the truth, it persisted, visible in the children, carried in the hearts of the enslaved, and whispered in shadows too quiet for the oppressors to fully control. The story of those 10 infants, hidden for months yet impossible to ignore, stands as a stark reminder that human suffering cannot remain buried forever, that the consequences of unchecked power always leave traces, and that even in the darkest corners, courage, solidarity, and resilience endure. The shocking revelation of what had been happening in those cabins forces a confrontation with the brutal realities of slavery, exposing a system built, not only on forced labor but on the systematic violation of the most basic human right. And while the oppressors may have believed themselves invisible,